Picture yourself walking through Harvard Yard. You can almost feel the history in the air, the ivy-covered walls, the centuries of tradition, the quiet confidence of a place that has shaped presidents, billionaires, and intellectual giants. It is the absolute pinnacle of the American academic establishment.
It really is.
Yeah.
An image of stability and prestige.
Now, try to square that image with this one. The President of the United States announces that this same institution, after a relentless pressure campaign involving billions in funding cuts, is about to pay $500 million to create what he calls a giant trade school.
A giant trade school run by Harvard. It sounds almost surreal.
Doesn't it? A place run by Harvard that will teach AI and produce workers for American factories, all as part of a mission to eliminate wokeness. It sounds like a scene from a political satire, but it's the reality of a clash that has pushed America's oldest university to a breaking point.
It's definitely not satire.
This isn't just a political squabble. It's a battle over academic independence, ideological control, and what the future of education in America will look like.
Yeah.
How did we get to a point where a university with a $50 billion endowment is being strong-armed into building vocational schools?
Well, that narrative, that collision between the ivory tower and this populist federal power, that's exactly what we need to navigate today. It's an extraordinary setup, really.
So what's our mission here? What are we trying to get to the bottom of?
Our mission is to understand how this conflict just escalated, how it went from, say, political rhetoric to actual mandatory institutional change. We need to unpack the specific, the detailed tactics of political leverage that were used.
Right, the nuts and bolts of the pressure campaign.
Exactly. And then analyze the fundamental legal fight over academic freedom, which is huge here. And crucially, explore the surprising future of education that's hinted at in this $500 million settlement.
Because it does seem to point towards something new, maybe unexpected.
It really does. This deep dive is about far more than just Harvard's finances, We're analyzing the dangerous precedent this sets for the independence of every university in the country, private and public. And, importantly, the future of research funding itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this political moment. You don't apply this kind of intense, targeted pressure to an institution like Harvard unless they're already, vulnerable in some way, right?
That's a key point. They were vulnerable.
So what was the groundwork? What was the pre-existing environment that allowed an administration to even launch such a comprehensive campaign of coercion?
Well, the foundation really was laid over maybe a decade of increasing public distrust in higher education. You look at the data. The latest figures show overall public confidence has just dropped drastically. It's down to 42%.
42%, that's low.
It is, but it gets worse. When you narrow it down to the elite institutions, the Ivy League specifically, that trust just collapses. It's a mere 15%.
15%? Wow, that's incredibly low. What does that signify?
It suggests the public isn't necessarily angry at education across the board, but they're specifically targeting or distrusting the perceived mission creep of these most exclusive schools. There's a disconnect there.
So why are institutions like Harvard and Yale seen as the specific problem here? I mean, if they're still producing intellectual giants, presidents, leaders, why the disconnect with the public?
Well, the core critique, the argument you hear a lot, is that these elite institutions kind of lost sight of academic excellence as their primary mission.
Okay, so what did they shift to?
Instead, they seem to adopt a mission focused more on, let's call it social engineering, or cultivating an elite with the right values, civic engagement, social awareness, that kind of thing.
Can you trace that shift? Is it explicit?
You can, actually. You can trace it in explicit institutional changes. Take Princeton, for example. Their informal motto shifted over time to focus on being in the nation's service and the service of humanity.
Which sounds noble on the surface.
It does sound noble, right? But critics argue this translated into prioritizing political and social alignment, maybe over pure intellectual rigor. That's the heart of the critique.
So when a university pivots, even subtly, towards selecting students based more on their potential for social change rather than purely academic merit, what are the measurable outcomes of that shift? What actually happens?
Well, you start to see measurable consequences that, arguably, undermine the very excellence they claim to uphold. First, you get politicization of the curriculum. Certain topics or viewpoints become dominant, others may be marginalized.
Okay, politicization. What else?
Second, and this is highly visible, you see grade inflation. If the core purpose shifts towards social molding or ensuring certain outcomes, well, failure becomes less acceptable, doesn't it? Rigorous academic standards can become secondary.
And that leads to...
Well, this combination ultimately leads to an estrangement from the broad American public. The values seem different. And that creates a perfect vulnerability for political attack. Because when a crisis did hit, these institutions lacked a deep reservoir of public goodwill to draw upon. They were exposed.
And the specific crisis that really served as the catalyst here, the immediate trigger for the administration's intervention, was that public relations disaster following the October 7th, 2023 attack and the subsequent student protests on campus.
Precisely. That was the flashpoint. The former Harvard president's congressional testimony regarding student speech, specifically her hesitant response when asked point blank if calling for the genocide of Jews would violate university rules. That became a really potent political symbol.
It was everywhere in the news.
It was everywhere. That incident, followed by her eventual resignation, and the widespread backlash from many Jewish organizations arguing institutions weren't adequately addressing anti-Semitism, well, that created the political opening.
The justification, in a way.
Exactly. It provided the administration with a seemingly justified legal entry point, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, to launch what many saw, and the courts later suggested, was ultimately an ideologically motivated pressure campaign.
Right. That brings us to the operational aspect of the pressure. Because this wasn't just, tweets or public condemnation. The administration developed a very strategic, multi-agency blueprint for control.
Oh, absolutely. It was a highly coordinated effort. It seemed designed for maximum impact and maybe minimal legal recourse. Although that part, as we'll see, failed later on.
So how did it start?
In early 2025, the administration launched this multi-agency task force to combat anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Its appointed leader, Leo Terrell, immediately signaled the administration's, let's say, true intent. He publicly declared they would bankrupt these universities and take away every single federal dollar.
Bankrupt these universities. That's incredibly aggressive language.
Extremely aggressive. This wasn't about seeking voluntary compliance or working things out. It was about forcing capitulation. The tone was set right there.
And that intent was then codified in these detailed demands Harvard received. It was framed as an agreement in principle in April 2025. But these weren't suggestions, were they?
Not at all. These were specific, invasive preconditions for Harvard to continue receiving any federal funding. Let's walk through the core demands, because they really reveal the administration's ultimate goal here, which seems to be ideological micromanagement.
It does seem that way. What were some of the key demands?
Well, they absolutely constitute a government attempt to dictate internal university functions, which is precisely why Harvard, from the very start, categorized them as a First Amendment violation. They saw it as government overreach immediately.
So the first demand was, frankly, shocking. Mandating a viewpoint diversity audit. What did that entail?
Yeah, that one was stunning. Harvard was required to commission an external third party to audit the entire university, the student body, the faculty, all the staff for viewpoint diversity. And not just overall, but department by department.
Department by department. That's incredibly granular.
It's unprecedented. It essentially requires the government to take an ideological census of a private university. The clear goal was to establish a mechanism for assessing and ultimately controlling the ideological balance on campus as defined by the administration.
Okay, so they do the audit. What then? What was the mechanism for fixing the perceived imbalance? That leads to the next demand, right? Mandatory hiring.
This is where it gets overtly coercive. Based on the results of this viewpoint audit, Harvard would be required to, quote, hire a critical mass of new faculty and also admit a critical mass of students, specifically to provide the government's desired viewpoint diversity.
Wait, the government gets to decide what the desired viewpoint diversity is and who gets hired or admitted to achieve it?
That's the implication. We're talking about the federal government demanding to be the de facto admissions officer and hiring director for a private institution. It completely bypasses academic freedom, tenure protections, everything. It uses the government's own definition of critical mass as the standard Harvard must meet.
It sounds like direct control. Now, if the administration's stated goal was to eliminate wokeness, the next demand seems like the most direct strike at the modern university structure, abolishing DEI.
That was absolutely non-negotiable in their proposal. The demand was to immediately and mandatorily shutter all diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI programs, offices, committees, positions, and initiatives. And importantly, under any name. They wanted to prevent rebranding.
And they had to prove it quickly.
Yes, demonstrate full compliance by August. This target was clearly political. It aimed to neutralize the administrative structure that's often associated, rightly or wrongly, with perceived ideological rigidity or wokeness on campus.
Then there was the demand for governance restructuring. Why target the governance structure itself? What was the goal there?
This seemed aimed at achieving long-term systemic control. The administration demanded reforms to empower senior, tenured professors, specifically those devoted primarily to scholarship, and simultaneously reduce the power of other groups.
Which groups?
Students, untenured faculty, and campus activists in university decision-making. The underlying rationale, it seems, was that the old guard, the tenured scholars, were maybe the last bastion of traditional academic values, while younger faculty and students were seen as the source of the ideological shift. So, by restructuring, they sought to insulate academic decisions from activist pressure.
And what about the immediate political targets, the students who were involved in the protests that sparked this whole thing?
There was a specific demand targeting them too, under discipline. Harvard had to agree to ban or discipline officers and active members of specific student groups identified by the administration. The Harvard-Palestine Solidarity Committee was named explicitly.
So punishing specific student groups?
Yes. This felt purely punitive, using institutional power directed by the government to control political speech and organization on campus.
And finally, one of the more unusual demands, perhaps, international student screening. What was that about?
Yeah, that was quite something. Requiring Harvard to reform its recruitment and screening processes to prevent admitting students deemed hostile to the American values and institutions inscribed in the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence.
How would they even measure that? It sounds incredibly subjective.
It's highly subjective, potentially discriminatory, absolutely. But it ties directly into another threat the administration was making, which was to control student visas. We'll get more into that, but it was part of the overall pressure package.
Okay, so it's clear this was a comprehensive plan, really, to seize ideological control. Harvard President Alan Garber refused. He put out a strong statement saying the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. That refusal, that triggered the immediate financial hammer, didn't it?
It did. The retaliation was instantaneous, it was massive, and it seemed designed to induce panic within the university. The administration immediately implemented a grant freeze.
How much are we talking about?
We're talking $2.2 billion in multi-year grants that were already approved, plus about $60 million in ongoing contracts. Just frozen, stopped. And subsequent freezes quickly targeted another $450 million in pledged funding.
That volume. Billions in frozen grants. That's a life support issue for a major research institution like Harvard. But the administration didn't stop there, did they?
Not at all. They escalated the threats significantly. The Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, threatened to revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. That's like the financial nuclear option for a nonprofit.
And the president publicly backed that.
He did. He publicly endorsed it, saying something like, it's what they deserve. And crucially, the Department of Homeland Security threatened to revoke Harvard's certification in the Student Exchange Visitor Program, usually known as SEVP.
We really need to pause on that SEVP threat because many people might not know what SEVP is, but revoking that certification, that would be an immediate catastrophe for the university, wouldn't it? Maybe even worse than the direct grant freeze in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. You could call it the silent financial weapon.
Yeah.
SEVP certification is what allows universities to enroll international students, those holding F1 visas. If Harvard certification were revoked, thousands of international students would instantly lose their legal status to remain in the U.S.
They'd have to leave immediately.
Immediately, they'd have to pack up and leave. This wouldn't just devastate Harvard's finances to the loss of tuition. International students often pay full tuition, but it would also cripple research labs that rely heavily on that global talent pool. It was a very clear demonstration that the administration was prepared to use every single regulatory lever it had to coerce compliance. No holds barred.
And these aren't just abstract numbers, billions of dollars floating around. This is real academic work, real research being sacrificed. And this is where the story of someone like Dr. Elena Petrova becomes so important. Can you remind us about her situation?
Yes. Dr. Petrova's story really illustrates the chilling effect perfectly. She was a postdoctoral researcher. Her genetics lab was working on a new therapeutic approach for a rare childhood disease. It was entirely supported by a multi-year federal grant.
Okay, so critical medical research.
Absolutely critical. When that grant freeze was announced, it didn't just stop the future flow of money. It legally halted her current research. Immediately, the lab equipment fell silent. Her team, many of whom rely on unstable temporary contracts anyway, was completely demoralized.
And the human cost.
For her, and more importantly, for the families who were waiting, hoping for the results of that research. Apolitical, potentially life-saving scientific progress was instantly transformed into just another political bargaining chip in a raging culture war. That's the real-world impact.
But Harvard didn't fold under this pressure. They actually sued the administration. What was their argument?
They sued, arguing that the funding freeze was illegal retaliation, specifically because they refused the ideological demands. They claimed those demands constituted unconstitutional coercion, violating their First Amendment rights.
And they found success, at least initially, at the district court level.
They did. On September 3rd, 2025, Judge Allison Burroughs issued a ruling. She found the funding freeze violated the First Amendment and was also arbitrary and capricious under administrative law.
And the judge's language in that ruling was remarkably strong, wasn't it?
It was incredibly direct. She wrote it was, quote, difficult to conclude anything other than that defendants used anti-Semitism as a smokescreen for a targeted, ideologically motivated assault on this country's premier universities. Strong words.
Anti-Semitism as a smokescreen. That's a powerful indictment. What were the core legal reasons for her ruling?
The judicial reasoning really centered on two major points. First was unconstitutional coercion. The court determined the administration was clearly attempting to force Harvard to adopt the government's own favored worldview regarding hiring, curriculum, speech regulation, the whole package.
And using the funding as the lever to do it.
Exactly, using federal funding as the lever. Crucially, the judge noted these demands were ideological and applied universally across the university. They weren't specifically tied to the non-discrimination goals of the actual federal grants being frozen. And leveraging non-programmatic funding to regulate institutional speech. That's pretty much the definition of unconstitutional coercion under existing precedent.
Okay, so that's the First Amendment part. What was the second main point of the ruling?
The second point focused on the administration's blatant disregard for established legal procedures, specifically those required under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. This might sound technical, but it was absolutely key to the judge's decision and revealed a lot about the administration's strategy.
Remind us what Title VI requires in these situations.
Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs receiving federal funding. Importantly, it mandates a very detailed step-by-step procedure before an agency can terminate or freeze those funds.
What kind of steps?
The procedure requires the administration to formally notify the institution of the alleged violation, give them a chance for a hearing, actively seek voluntary compliance first, and then report everything to the relevant congressional committees 30 days before any termination takes effect. It's designed to prevent arbitrary action.
And why did the administration just skip all those mandatory steps?
Well, that's the crucial strategic point. Following those steps would have taken months. It would have allowed Harvard significant time to prepare its legal defense, and it would have required the administration to formally demonstrate specific, measurable violations directly related to anti-discrimination, not just broad ideological complaints.
So skipping the process allowed them to act faster and avoid scrutiny.
Precisely. By skipping the mandatory procedural steps, they could implement the punitive freezes immediately. It bypassed due process entirely and forced Harvard into a high-pressure bilateral negotiation outside the traditional legal framework established by Congress. The judge viewed this procedural violation as clear proof that the administration's real goal wasn't genuinely enforcing civil rights under Title VI, but rather achieving political ends through raw, unilateral force.
This whole clash was obviously a major political gamble, a huge news story. We need to talk about the students who were caught in this crossfire. What was the human cost of weaponizing these really serious issues, anti-Semitism, DEI, as tools for political compliance?
It's really the definition of a culture war creating casualties, isn't it?
Yeah.
You mentioned thinking about specific people. Consider someone like Ben, a hypothetical but representative junior at one of these universities.
Hey, what's Ben's story?
Ben is politically active, maybe leans left, and also identifies strongly as Jewish. When the administration and parts of the media started labeling his entire university as some kind of anti-Semitic woke factory, he felt completely isolated, caught in the middle.
How so?
Well, on one hand, he takes the issue of anti-Semitism very seriously. It affects him personally. But he also saw political opportunists cynically using that legitimate concern as a weapon to attack progressive causes and campus groups he also believes in or is part of.
So his identity was being co-opted and simplified by external forces.
Exactly. He felt trapped between two extremes. You had political figures using his identity as a cudgel to bash the left. And then sometimes internally on campus, he might have felt that his genuine concerns about the campus climate regarding anti-Semitism were being dismissed or downplayed by administrators who were maybe more worried about bad press or appearing unwoke.
It sounds like the struggle just reduced complex identities and issues into simple political caricatures.
That's a good way to put it. It forced students into really uncomfortable choices and erased a lot of nuance.
And the pressure campaign, while Harvard fought back, it did work on some other institutions, didn't it? That showed the range of institutional vulnerability.
That distinction is crucial for understanding the precedent that was set here. Harvard's refusal to just surrender its constitutional rights, their willingness to sue, forced this legal battle into the open. But other universities took a different path.
Like Columbia.
Yes, Columbia University,
Yeah.
facing very similar threats and investigations, ultimately agreed to pay a massive fine, $221 million, and essentially codified many of the administration's demands into their policies.
What kind of demands did Columbia agree to?
Things like hiring new faculty, specifically to supervise politically sensitive academic programs, like those focused on Middle Eastern studies. Also, increasing campus security powers directed against student activists. Brown University also reached a settlement agreement around July 2025, accepting certain governance modifications as well.
So the administration effectively demonstrated they had two paths to offer universities: engage in costly, high-stakes litigation with massive funding loss hanging over your head, or settle. And settling meant paying huge fines and accepting deep institutional changes dictated by Washington.
That was the choice they presented.
Which brings us to the truce, this pivot away from protracted litigation towards a more political solution, which was announced around September 30th, 2025. What happened there?
Well, the legal victory at the district level for Harvard actually created a kind of impasse. The administration had been rebuked by the court, but the funding was still technically frozen pending appeals. The administration needed a political win, something they could trumpet. And Harvard, despite the legal win, desperately needed the funding restored to get research back online.
So a settlement became attractive to both sides.
It appears so. The president announced they were very close to a deal. And the terms were striking. Harvard would pay about $500 million. And the president declared, quite pointedly, that after this payment and investment, Harvard's sins are forgiven.
Their sins are forgiven, that phrasing. It really does suggest this isn't a typical legal settlement based on damages, but more like a political penance, doesn't it?
It absolutely frames it that way. Less about legal liability, more about political absolution.
So what is the specific mechanism for that $500 million? Is it just a fine paid to the Treasury?
No, and this is the really interesting pivot. The funds are explicitly earmarked. They are designated to create a giant trade school, a series of trade schools that would be run by Harvard. Run by Harvard, focusing intensively on things like artificial intelligence, specialized manufacturing skills, and generally producing skilled workers for American factories. Harvard signaled that spending the funds this way, on workforce training, was a viable path to resolution. It allowed them to redirect the money away from being seen as just a punitive fine into an initiative that was conveniently politically favorable to the administration's agenda.
This is an absolutely radical pivot, though. Harvard University, its entire institutional identity, its comparative advantage, is built on high-level theoretical knowledge, elite research, shaping leaders, being forced, essentially, to build vocational trade schools. That's a massive shift in institutional mission.
It is. You could say it forces Harvard to embrace the idea of practicality in a way it never has before. Harvard's traditional mission, as you said, is creating knowledge, shaping elites. Vocational education, which focuses squarely on immediate applicable job skills, is almost the institutional opposite.
It really highlights the power of political leverage, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows how powerful that leverage can be when the government can effectively dictate a university's core mission as a condition for receiving essential federal research dollars.
But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Is this forced alignment necessarily a bad thing? Does compelling Harvard to get into vocational training actually address a real economic need in the country?
Well, there's a strong argument that it does. This initiative aligns perfectly with the administration's broader focus on promoting vocational education, on seeing it as a crucial, viable alternative to the traditional four-year degree for many people.
And is there a documented need for that?
Oh, absolutely. There is a well-documented shortage of skilled labor in critical areas like advanced manufacturing, IT, and particularly in specialized fields where AI is rapidly being integrated into the workplace. We're clearly moving into an economy where specific, credentialed, practical, up-to-date skills are often more valuable in the job market than, say, a generalized humanities degree.
That shift in the value proposition of different kinds of education is powerful.
It is. And the data we have tends to support the effectiveness of high-quality career and technical education, CTE programs. Studies have shown that rigorous CTE programs can significantly increase high school graduation rates, especially for low-income students, sometimes by up to 15%.
So if Harvard applies its resources.
Right. If Harvard attaches its immense prestige, its resources, its organizational power to developing cutting-edge AI-driven manufacturing credentials, those certifications will instantly carry significant weight in the labor market. They'll be valuable.
But there's a potential disconnect, isn't there? Can Harvard, an institution historically built on academic abstraction and, let's be honest, elitism, effectively connect with the people who actually need these vocational schools the most? We have to look at the human element here, the potential skepticism involved.
That class tension, that cultural gap is unavoidable. It's a huge challenge. Think about someone like Mike, maybe a 52-year-old former factory worker in Michigan. Let's say he was automated out of his job 5 years ago.
Okay.
He hears on the news that Harvard is going to build a school to train people like him for the factories of the future. What's his first reaction likely to be?
Probably deep skepticism, maybe even cynicism.
Exactly. Deep-seated skepticism. He likely views it through the lens of the political settlement he just read about. Just another, empty promise from coastal elites who have historically overlooked or even disdained his community and his way of life.
That gap between the ivory tower and the factory floor feels enormous. How does that skepticism even begin to erode? How does this initiative gain legitimacy on the ground?
It has to start with perceived value. Maybe Mike talks to his daughter, let's say she's in community college, trying to figure out her path. She tells him, Dad, look, an AI-driven manufacturing credential, if it's backed by Harvard's rigor and reputation, that could actually be a real pathway to a stable, good-paying job.
So the next generation sees the potential value.
Potentially. That's how the narrative might shift, slowly, from seeing it as just a political stunt to maybe a source of, let's call it, cautious, fragile hope. But the challenge for Harvard is immense. It's not just about opening a building with their name on it. It's about developing a curriculum and a culture that respects the dignity and the practical experience of manual laborers while delivering truly valuable modern skills in things like robotics, advanced diagnostics, process automation. That's a heavy lift for Harvard.
Beyond the immediate impact on workers and Harvard's mission, this deal also creates a significant market signal, doesn't it? What does a $500 million government-mandated investment in vocational AI training by Harvard do to the broader education and investment market?
It acts as a huge catalyst for private capital. Think about it. When the most prestigious, most academically insulated institution in America is essentially forced into the vocational training sector, it massively legitimizes the entire field in the eyes of investors.
So money follows the signal.
Money follows the signal. This attracts private equity firms, venture capitalists, who are always looking for scalable programs. Vocational tech, career training. These often offer lower overhead costs, quicker development cycles, and potentially much faster returns compared to investing in traditional four-year universities. So this political compromise, in a way, inadvertently aligns the federal government's workforce development priorities with the financial goals of the private sector. Trade schools become identified as the new, high-growth educational opportunity. That's exactly right. Private investors can now more easily capitalize on the growing demand for modular training, for micro-credentials, for industry-specific certifications that are tightly aligned with employer needs. And they can use the public attention generated by this whole Harvard confrontation to underscore the urgency, the market need, for human capital development, especially in the AI era.
Okay, let's zoom out again as we head towards wrapping up. Let's analyze the broader implications of this whole institutional crisis. What are the long-term consequences of using federal funding as a tool to enforce ideological compliance on universities?
Well, perhaps the most dangerous consequence is the establishment of the shakedown precedent. That's what some critics are calling it. The administration successfully demonstrated a willingness and an ability to bypass legally required procedures like those mandated under Title VI, specifically to achieve these coercive bilateral deals outside the normal legal or regulatory process.
And the danger is that future administrations could use this playbook.
Precisely. Future administrations, regardless of their political stripe, left or right now, have a potential playbook. They can leverage the federal funding pipeline not just to enforce established non-discrimination laws, but potentially to dictate institutional governance, admissions policies, curriculum content, faculty hiring, all based on whatever the prevailing ideological criteria of the day might be. That's a fundamental threat to academic independence.
And the practical, immediate damage caused by that massive grant freeze we discussed. That ripples through the entire research community, doesn't it? Beyond just Harvard.
It creates a massive and widespread chilling effect, particularly on talent retention and recruitment. We saw reports, hundreds of American CEOs publicly criticized these attacks on universities. They warned that the funding cuts, the threats to international visa programs like SEVP, all of it directly undermines American economic competitiveness by disrupting the pipeline of talent and innovation that universities provide.
But let's look specifically at the researchers themselves again. How did all this uncertainty affect the scientific community directly?
The impact was deeply unsettling, bordering on panic for some. There was a poll taken shortly after the initial funding freezes were announced. It found that 75%, three-quarters of U.S. scientists, were actively considering leaving the country in response to these education policies and the sheer funding volatility.
75%, that is an astonishing number.
It's staggering. Three-quarters of the scientific community entertaining departure. It suggests that if academics feel their long-term, often apolitical research, whether it's in basic physics or medical genetics like Dr. Petrova, can be instantaneously jeopardized by a political spat they have absolutely no control over, well, rationally, they're going to seek more stable research environment abroad. It poses an immediate brain drain threat to American innovation.
So if this crisis forces elite schools like Harvard to really confront their relationship with the broader American public, to rethink their role, what's the best possible outcome here? What could be good for American higher education in the long run?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? The crisis really demands a redefinition of the mission for these elite schools. They need to publicly, explicitly, and convincingly recommit to making rigorous education and cutting-edge research their primary mission once again.
Which means reversing some trends.
It means reversing the trends that arguably led to that deep public distrust in the first place. Things like restoring more objective admissions criteria that are clearly focused on academic merit. Maybe finally tackling widespread grade inflation. Prioritizing academic rigor across all departments regardless of current political or social trends.
So this circles right back to that initial critique we discussed, the idea of moving away from perceived social engineering and getting back to core intellectual excellence.
Precisely. And the final implication, perhaps the most ironic twist, given how it came about through the $500 million settlement, is the argument that the best thing for American higher education overall might actually be for its most elite schools to become, in a sense, less elite in their definition of public service.
How?
By embracing vocational training, by directly addressing immediate workforce needs, Harvard is being involuntarily pushed kicking and screaming, perhaps to reconnect with the broader idea of serving the public good, serving beyond just selecting and molding a specific political and social elite. It's a forced, incredibly expensive reconnection with practicality, you could say.
So, wrapping this up, we have witnessed a remarkable collision of two massive forces: the entrenched, centuries-old academic establishment of Harvard and the targeted, focused, populist force of federal power wielded by an administration. This deep dive really confirms that the $500 million trade school deal isn't just some financial agreement or legal settlement. It feels more like a monument. A monument to the price of political independence, maybe, or perhaps the cost of institutional pride and perceived mission drift.
That's a good way to frame it.
The fight involved billions in lost grants, it jeopardized critical life-saving research, and it exposed a fundamental systemic dispute over who ultimately controls the curriculum, the values taught, and even the composition of students and faculty in America's most powerful and prestigious institutions.
And the core takeaway, I think, the lesson here, is that academic freedom, while it's certainly protected conceptually by the Constitution, is not somehow magically safe from tactical political attack, particularly when universities rely so heavily on government funding, as most major research universities do.
The vulnerability was the funding stream.
Absolutely. The administration clearly communicated through its actions that federal support is now potentially contingent on adherence to specific ideological criteria, a really catastrophic potential shift away from the long-standing tradition of academic autonomy in America. So while the final resolution pushes Harvard toward a practical, and you could argue socially necessary purpose training the future AI workforce, the bruising legal battle confirmed a deeply disturbing precedent. That allegations of bias, whether it's anti-Semitism or wokeness or anything else, can be engineered and weaponized as a political tool, a tool to micromanage the internal affairs of even the most powerful private universities. And that could create a lasting chilling effect across the entire research and education sector in this country, forcing institutions to constantly look over their shoulder, wondering if their funding is safe from the shifting political winds.